A popular hadith frequently cited, especially in lexicographical works when discussing the word nabi or the meaning of nabr to apply the hamza, is, I believe, first attested in Al-Khalil bin Ahmad's Kitab al-Ain, and it goes as follows. قال رجل للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يا نبي الله فقال لا تنبر باسمي. Some man said to the Prophet, O Prophet of God. The Prophet retorted, do not put a hamza in my name. While there are versions of this hadith with minor variants, the gist remains the same. An unnamed figure addressed the Prophet with the form Nabi, to which the Prophet objects and expresses the wish to be addressed without a hamza, that is, Nabi. Of course, there is good reason to think that this hadith was forged. It is never cited within Isnad, and it's difficult to accept that in the lifetime of the Prophet, linguistic terminology was already developed enough for the Prophet to have plausibly used such jargon. Western scholars have often invoked this hadith in order to argue that Hijazis who had lost the hamza in their speech would sometimes apply it hypercorrectly. Zvetler goes so far as to say that it is a peculiar Hijazi pseudo-correction and a feature neither of the ʿArabiyyah nor of other dialects. This is part of a larger argument that argues against the possibility that the Quran would have ever been recited in a mode of recitation that entirely lacked the hamza. To Zvetler, it is obvious that the ʿArabiyyah must have retained the hamza in all places. But whence is certainty that the literary register called the ʿArabiyyah was so homogeneous in the treatment of hamza? And whence the certainty that it could not have had a hamza in the word nabi at any point? How can we be so certain that we can project this normative judgment of Al-Khalil, which first appears more than a century after the standardization of the Quranic text, applied in that period? Indeed, it is not exactly obvious why we would have to assume that nabi is the original form and nabi a later hypercorrection. After all, there can be little doubt that this word is a loanword from Hebrew or Aramaic, and in both languages this word originally had a hamza. While the fairly late reading tradition of Hebrew no longer preserves a hamza in the singular, it is still present in the plural. Navi, plural, vi'im. The aleph in the Hebrew consonantal text leaves little doubt that the language of the consonantal text had it. As for Biblical Aramaic, the spelling unambiguously points to a pronunciation with hamza, despite the received pronunciation of reading tradition having lost it. The pronunciation of nabi, on the face of it, looks like an archaism, and nabi is more likely a dialectal realization. The claim that such a pronunciation is not part of the ʿArabiyyah, nor part of any spoken form, seems to be based on Sibawayh's judgment, who considers the pronunciation of nabi and also bari'ah, creation, to be rare and abhorrent. But despite this clear disdain for this pronunciation, which he seems to have shared with his teacher Al-Khalil bin Ahmad, Sibawayh considers the origin of the word nabi to be nabi, and bari'ah to be the origin of bariyah. He explicitly mentions this word when discussing the dropping of the hamza when u, i, or I precedes, adding that in such cases the hamza has to be replaced with a waw and a ya respectively, citing khati'ah becoming khatiyah, nabi becoming nabi, maqru' becoming maqru', Ufayis becoming Ufayis, Bari'ah becoming Bariyah, and Suwayil becoming Suwayil. His disapproval of the pronunciation of Nabi'ah and Bari'ah does not stem from a conviction that these words should have never had a hamza to begin with, but is rather because he considered the dropping of the hamza in these words more common and appropriate. This is no different from Al-Khalil, who lists Nabi under his entry for the root Naba'ah. Why then is there such confidence that ʿArabiyyah always only had the form nabi from the time immemorial until today? It seems to me that this has got to do with the fact that nabi is the form that the Standard of Classical Arabic endorses today. It is the form that we find in Modern Standard Arabic Dictionary of Hans Wehr, and this is how the word is printed in modern text editions of Classical Arabic texts. But we cannot simply backproject whatever we believe to be the language today onto a pre-Sibawayhian period. Nor can we conclude that whatever Sibawayh considered bad cannot be proper classical Arabic. After all, had the approval of Sibawayh been the golden standard for what is to be considered classical Arabic, the standard pronunciation of minhu and anhu would have been minhu and anhu, and not minhu and anhu as the classical standard holds today. The situation becomes even more complex if we dispense with our focus on the Basran teacher-student duo Al-Khalil and Sibawayh and see what other contemporaneous scholars consider to be proper pronunciation of Nabi. The Medinan Quran reciter Nafi is in fact famous for its recitation of this word as Nabi, along with Bari'ah, creation, Nubu'ah, prophecy. Something universally reported for him, and there is little doubt that it is the pronunciation he taught to his students. Nafi' is of course one of the 7 canonical reciters, and in fact the second most popular reciter in the world today, with millions of North African Muslims still following his reading in the transmissions of his students Warsh and Qalun. Clearly, Nafi', whose reading was considered Sunnah according to Malik bin Anas, did not consider this pronunciation abhorrent in any way. We are presented now with 2 diametrically opposed views on what the proper pronunciation is by 2 scholars from the same period. If we are to maintain that the Quranic recitations are the ʿArabiyyah, we must conclude that Nabi', despite Sibawayh's misgivings, was part of the ʿArabiyyah too. This alternative pronunciation gained sufficient fame that it is still adhered to by millions of Muslims today. While it may still be true that Nabi' is a hypercorrection, this is not obvious from the sources normally cited as evidence for it. One cannot project the modern accepted norms onto the early Islamic period, nor can Sibawayh be taken as the sole authority of what is and is not the ʿArabiyyah. As scholars, we cannot afford such anachronistic oversimplifications. The negotiation on what the norms of the ʿArabiyyah were had clearly not yet come to a close in the middle of the 2nd century Hijri. That a norm eventually crystallizes and settles for Nabi in later centuries should not and cannot be a factor for deciding what the ʿArabiyyah would have been like in the first centuries of Islam or the pre-Islamic periods. Of course, this word of caution should not be taken to only apply to the presence or absence of Hamza in this word or any other word. The discussion of the history of the Arabic language all too frequently revolves around anachronistic imposition of modern norms onto the early Islamic and even the pre-Islamic periods. Our understanding of the ʿArabiyyah must be based on the evidence as presented by the early sources, and we must accept the ambiguities that they entail.